Okay, so let's start with this. A reduced committee, but very interested people. So I'm really happy to introduce Najmeh Khalili-Mahani today, and thank you very much for accepting giving this talk to our team. So did her PhD at McGill University in neuroscience, and she did also a postdoc at Leiden University in Netherlands, and then come back to Canada and work with McGill. She was a researcher at the Confounding Center, so she created the media health lab at the Confounding Center. And this lab is still continuing, with the Milieu Institute.
Yeah.
Is that right? That's the case. And so she is an expert in developing application and information in communication technology, but with the focus in health, and especially in area of anxiety reduction and all those things who are related to both starting from social area, moving to health, and moving also to the technology and application in technology. It's really a large area of expertise. And so today, her talk is about paying attention to sampling bias in study of healthy aging. So, Naj, thank you very much again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Habib, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be talking to the lab, and thank you for the kind introduction. I really enjoyed the fact that you encapsulated the work that I have done. And what I'm going to be presenting today is actually the work that I have learned through, the research studies that I started at Perform. As Habib said, I'm coming from a pure neuroimaging, neuroscience background, and then coming to Concordia and working with the Engaged Center, the Milieu, and sort of moving a little bit from neuroscience into the areas of art and technology. It sort of allowed me to look at the problem specifically of recruitment and intersection between technology, brain sciences, and social sciences in a different way. So this is a perspective that I thought might be interesting to my fellow engineers in this department as you're working on various technologies for understanding the brain, but also creating new technologies for interventions towards promoting healthy aging. I'll briefly go over healthy aging, its importance in today's society. So all of us are working in this field, but it's important to sort of understand the historical context of where these studies of healthy aging are coming from, what they're anchored to. They have been since almost 400 years ago to now. And this is going to sort of bring us or focus our attention on a double bind, which is ageism, coming from the fact that we are paying too much attention to age, the narratives that we are using to sort of describe age, the problems with age, and the problems that we are trying to solve specifically as engineers. And I want to specifically give a few examples of how this focus on ageism is likely to create bias in sampling. So for you as data scientists, it's very important to consider who are the population in the data pool, in these massive data pools that we are working with. And I think this is an area that is not paid enough attention to, but it's something that is being addressed, again, with this intersectoral work that is happening. And then I will provide some of the guidelines and introduce, give a brief teaser of a digital sort of strategy that we have conceived, initially paying attention to chronic pain, but then there are a lot of commonalities between chronic pain and the problems that we are trying to address in aging. So this is a tool that if anybody is interested, it's a playground, you can come and play and collaborate on that. So healthy aging, some of you might know that the WHO has recently introduced a strategy for the decade of healthy aging, and the healthy aging basically reflects the capacity for maintaining functional abilities, specifically mobility and cognitive abilities as through the lifespan, especially in the later years of life. And the idea of healthy aging is that individuals, as they're going through their life, they need to be able to, or they want to be able to make similar contributions across the lifespan. So the big focus of healthy aging is to avoid disability and to becoming sort of a burden to oneself and also to the society. Now, the term successful aging was first introduced in 1987. This is sort of concurrent with advances in neuroscience, sort of showing that there are these molecules, that the brain is a plastic organ, that the hippocampus is constantly, wiring and rewiring. This is the work that Bruce McEwen sort of pioneered. And with this conceptualization of the brain plasticity, of brain being responsive to stress hormones, being responsive to sort of other kind of catabolic and metabolic effects in the physiology, the idea that the lifestyle and the behavior and the environment would have an impact on the health status of the population, it became to the foray of attention. So at that time, they listed a number of potential factors. So they range from biology to psychology to environment to the economics, and all of those things together would be impacting the way an individual is aging, is maintaining full health or not. Now, you're probably familiar. There are various ways of looking into studies of aging, and I have sort of given some canonical examples of the type of questions that we are interested in healthy aging studies. So for instance, there's a group of people who are interested in predicting age. So we accept the fact that not everybody who is 65 has the same kind of physical and mental ability as the other 65-year-old person. So we say that age is not just the bin that everybody would fit into. So let's look at other biomarkers that would define how a person is aging. So for instance, brain age prediction using deep learning. If you have gone to HBM conferences, you see that there are quite a number of studies that are looking at brain biomarkers, and they're trying to predict the age of the individuals. There are studies that are looking at the predictions, at the predictors of healthy aging. They identify a group of super agers. For instance, at Perform, we had Ed Whitlock, was his name? Yeah. So who was this 90, I don't know, almost 100-year-old marathon runner in full health. And those become the model of healthy aging. And then we try to sort of figure out what are the characteristics in terms of lifestyle, behavior, genes, biology that is making an individual healthy ager. And based on that, we are coming up with these preventive, protective, or sort of rehabilitational interventions that are going to make sure that somebody, or hoping that somebody would be maintaining health as they age. Now, this is going back to the 17th century. So the 17th century is sort of the rise of the scientific revolution. There is a close association between mathematics and understanding of how the brain is working. If you look into the history, or if you look into, the images of Descartes, sort of linking the dynamics of movement to the brain, how the geometry of how the brain is acting and how it's regulating movement, then you would appreciate as mathematicians that this is a really deep history. So at the same time, the early version of data science is happening as the probability theory is introduced, as people start looking at the bill of mortality, so going through the life records of individuals in England, in the Netherlands, to sort of figure out who are the people who are likely to die of younger age, older age. And why is all of these things important? Because we are in the middle of an industrial revolution. The insurance industry is introduced, the banking industry is introduced, and it's important to sort of know, what is the lifespan? How much insurance should one receive for their disability or for living long? and all of those things. So these calculations come into the socio-political, economic thinking of the time of the industrial society in the 17th century. So it's good to sort of always keep in mind that when we are going through the discourse of healthy aging, we are constantly thinking the economy, the cost of aging, and we enter into a biopolitical hemisphere. Now, of course, science relies on reproducible observations of certain phenomena, but then what makes them scientific is that those certain phenomena are taking place under random conditions. And this is sort of the basic of most of the statistical and the probability work that we are doing. We are trying to sort of find a normal sample collected under random conditions. So we want the populations to be randomly sampled. We want to randomize the experimental setting. We want to add control changes in those experimental conditions and measure the tiny, minute changes that sort of are occurring as a result of those experimental variations. We want to measure the variations in the outcome that are measured by different parameterization. And more recently, we have computers that are helping us to find patterns, to classify the phenomena. And we are now in the area of predicting outcomes. So, now we have supercomputers that are allowing us to collect massive amount of data and basically be able to personalize medicine and say, okay, if this person has this and that profile, then it's likely that they would be falling in this or that category. Now, the pitfall of reproducibility is scientific stigma. So imagine if, and this is what science has failed a couple of times in the course of the history. They try to come and predict that, for instance, based on the shape of the skull, a person would have a certain personality. You would be surprised that this kind of actually studies of looking at the shape of the forehead and the skull in relation to something like morality and criminality is still happening in science. Luckily, we don't see any of those. But if you look into the literature, that still exists and is published by the Royal Society of, I don't know, one of these royal societies. So the mentality is still there. But look at the kind of scientific stigma that can emerge from these statistical reductionism of specific populations. Old people are more likely to get sick. So they're going to be increasing the healthcare costs. In some of the analysis that we did during the COVID, we saw quite a bit of negative expressions from the young people towards the old who were held responsible for locking everyone up. Old people are more likely to develop cognitive problems, so they cannot contribute to the workforce. They cannot drive, for instance. Old people are more likely to get COVID, socially isolate them, whether they need to be isolated or not. A lot of them are actually resistant to this fact. Or that exercise leads to healthy aging, and therefore those who are old and who are not healthy, then something must have been wrong with their lifestyle. And not only this sort of perpetuates an ageism in the society, but it also creates self-ageism, this internalized prejudices that one has towards themselves. Now, ageism, interestingly, it's a concept that was introduced in 1969, again, concurrent with the rise of sort of understanding of how the brain is working, how the memory is, how the memory is forming, all of those things, and sort of paying more attention to the problem of healthy aging. And Butler, he was the first director of the Institute of Aging at the NIH. And one of the things that he noticed, and he wrote about it in the newspapers, is sort of the negative perception of old people in certain neighborhoods in Boston. And he started by paying attention to the fact that, in some news outlets, they were talking about neighborhoods being dominated by old people and then having a negative perception of that old population in that old neighborhood. So he started to sort of create a movement, write a book, and started paying attention to the fact that age should not be equivalent to disability, and age should not be a source for discrimination. So he paid attention to the fact that the stereotyping of older adults based on age and abilities should be avoided. Discrimination based on age is some of the things that he observed and sort of he started the movement against, and that institutional and policy practices, they should also be modified to not perpetuate aging stereotypes. Now, aging is not always, the stereotypes of aging are not always negative. There are also positive stereotypes of aging. So for instance, when we are valorizing somebody who is old and who is very active and who is, very athletic and who can do this and that, imagine the kind of pressure that it's putting on those who are old and who have not aged with the same kind of mental and physical capacity. A lot of them feel that they have failed, they feel guilty. And an important consequence of this is that these normative values, they create a condition in which successful aging becomes a personal responsibility. So the society suddenly can wash its hands off and say, okay, if this person is ill because they're smokers, if this old person cannot move, is because they did not exercise. So these are some of the tensions that need to be addressed. Now, the real problem for us as scientists is that this kind of ageism and self-ageism can create sampling bias. How could that happen? Levy, who is a gerontologist, she has been has been doing several experiments on implicit biases that are associated with perception of individuals about their own age and other aging populations. And what she's finding is that our tendency to have a negative view of age is something that is inherent. And actually, it's one of those things that we start learning about when we are kids. So when they're studying kids, they realize that kids are always associating aging with deficit, or associating old people with being people who are clumsy. And there is just negative understanding of being old as being something that is bad. Now, this is specifically cultural. So in some societies, mostly in Oriental societies, that is not the case. Being old is sort of valorized, you have more respect. But for those of us who are coming from, a mixed background of Eastern, and you become into encounter with the Western society, we do see this tension quite strongly. Now, these aging stereotypes, they do create implicit biases. So they have done a bunch of priming studies, and then they have realized that when they are sort of bringing the word old into the conversation, it somehow tends to sort of divert the discussions, or the or sort of the expressions, even the artistic expressions, towards more negative traits. So there is this implicit bias that old is bad and young is good. And this is something that we use in our language. But what is interesting is that older adults, they do experience aging self-stereotypes as well. And they call that sort of self-ageism. These stereotypes, they come from our internalization of being old as being deficient as we are kids. They sort of perpetuate in our culture as we are using the language that is equating being old with, negative traits, and then they become self-stereotypes. So we are constantly trying to avoid becoming old. It manifests in some people as they're trying really all sorts of tricks in the book to look young, but it can also create another bias in our data. As people who feel that they're old, they tend to have more negative health outcomes. And this is something that she has shown in a range of studies, and especially in some of those studies that are looking at, for instance, the cognitive performance of people who have a negative aging stereotype about themselves and those who don't. And then they see that as people who are self-ageist, they usually perform worse, or they participate less in the studies. So what this causes is that people who think that I'm old, I'm too old to do this, I'm too old to do that, A, they do not approach research that we are doing, and B, even if they approach it, then they are already resigned to it, and they do not perform well, they do not do the best that they can do. So that is, again, creating a bias in the data that is not related to the actual capacities of the people, but it's related to their perceptions of their capacities.
They did for the data. You said that they said I'm too old
Yeah, so for instance, the task would be simple cognitive tasks. So like do this cognitive training, or I would show you an example of a task that we have done with gaming. So basically any task that you would give, they have found an association between people who have a negative perception of aging that is correlating with their performance in those tasks. So the more negative your perception of aging, for instance, the worse you would do in a memory cognitive task. So it's just a range of these things that they can do. Yeah, it's mostly cognitive. But I think they have also looked at the heart rate variability in some physical tasks as well. So I think in their studies they have that as well. They have it's like the paper that I put here. It's a review of some of the studies that they have done. Now, people have been looking at the recruitment and retention of older adults in studies, especially clinical trials. And in clinical trials, it's important to sort of really maintain this random sort of inclusion of participants and to be as inclusive as possible, because the trials, the outcome of the trials really would would vary if the sampling is not random. And what they have found in recruitment of older adults is that mistrust about confidentiality, safety, and the purpose of research is one of the impediments to participant in research. Lack of access to knowledge, to transportation, and to medical support, and also language and cultural differences. And this is particularly a problem in recruiting from minorities and from individuals from marginalized and racialized population. So they tend to be less likely to participate in research. Now, facilitators to recruitment of volunteers, on the other hand, in people who are trying to sort of create a good data set and then retain people through the course of whatever study that they're doing, is that people who are participating in these studies usually do have a higher capacity, physical, financial, and mental capacity. They're curious about this kind of research that they're doing. There is another group of people who are more likely to participate in research, and they are catastrophizers. So in neuroscience, we do see the concept of memory complainers, people who are actually fine, but then they think that their memory is declining, and they are more likely to be sort of volunteering for any of these healthy aging studies. And also those who are in need of medical attention. That is something that we do see in Canada, people who cannot get an MRI, through the medical system, but then the research is providing an opportunity for them to sort of look at the incidental finding if that is emerging. Now, another gerontologist by the name of Tracy Gendron, she has written a book, and this book is really interesting. I recommend you read it or listen to it. I've listened to it twice. And she's a scientist. She's actually a researcher, in a healthy aging researcher. And she's talking about how we ourselves as, gerontologists or geriatricians, we tend to have these aging stereotypes in our own mind, and how we are sort of using a language that is perpetuating aging stereotypes. So for instance, they have looked at a set of, they've given an assignment to a group of medical students to sort of have them converse with older adults, and then they have tried to analyze the language that is emerging from the conversation between these young students and the older adults. And they find even positive statements such as this: they're almost 4 times my age and living lives full of learning, activism, and purpose. They make aging look easy. My mentor made me realize the importance of treating the elderly with the same attitude and approach for treating younger patients. So when you're reading this, it's sort of really betraying the implicit biases in this medical student, because he or she is still valorizing an old person who is like a young person. And because an old person is doing things exactly like a young person is doing, then, okay, I think we all have to move with something.
Because that one is on the screen is still on.
Lovely. Concordia loses power.
Yeah, it's power good.
Cool. Well, we can focus on this. It's now more interesting. So with this, where was I? So interestingly, actually, these differences in the language of aging studies, it's something that you can find it in literature as well. We did a literature review, just a mapping review of recruitment of older adults into studies of studies that involve incorporation of information and communication technologies towards interventions for healthy aging. And then what we found, so about like 180 papers, clinical trials, they fit our selection criteria. And our selection criteria, they had to be focusing on older adults. They had to sort of involve the concept of healthy aging or successful aging, and they had to relate to the ICTs. And then what we found is that in most of these papers, the justification for doing the research was mainly focusing on deficits of aging and the costs of aging. So most of the time when you're reading any paper or any grant, we start with, by year 2050, the population of the older adults is going to be this and that. So all of us are moving towards this catastrophic future in which the old hapless people are going to be needing some form of intervention, in this case, mechanical robotic intervention. What we found is also that qualitative studies, those that are focusing on design and on needs of the older adults, they're more careful in using the language that is non-ageist compared to the studies that are initiated from engineering schools or from medical schools. Heterogeneity in the study results were observed, but then this heterogeneity really didn't have anything to do with age. So it wasn't because the old people were not cognitively able to deal with ICTs. It's just because they didn't accept the technology. They didn't want the technology. They didn't have a need for it. So these are some of the important factors to be considered. Successful studies were those that engaged with participants over a longer period of time. They were longitudinal, they involved research participants in the study design, and they actually paid attention to their needs, for instance, disability, for instance, inability to sort of remember when to take their medication, than on their age. So age as a category of 65 and plus is very arbitrary. And one of the things that sort of prevented people from studying or from continuing into these studies was fear of stigma. Yes.
What is the aim of this research?
The aim of which research?
Because, for example, as a researcher, when I want to deal with a project, I need to deal with many different teams. And in the middle, if I want to think also about the language we want to use, it just burden what I want to do. So I think the aim of the research is make our research difficult than help us to do our research in an easier way.
So let's come back to this question, because that is the crux of the problem that we are discussing, that if you want to do research in an easy way, so doing research with human subjects is not easy. That's the crux of the problem. We, especially as data scientists, we have to be aware of the complexity of the human conditions. If we do not pay attention to the complexity of the human conditions, we are going to have data that is biased. Data is biased because participants would not be joining your research. So you're going to have a sample that is biased from the beginning, from the recruitment, and the research that you're doing is not going to be valid, and you're going to be running into trouble in interpretation of your data, because if you have dealt in the brain sciences, you would learn that heterogeneity and inter-individual differences, they make a massive difference in the outcomes, even in the brain function, for instance. And this is why nowadays in most of these data science studies, people are paying attention to the personal aspects. We're talking about the precision medicine. So precision medicine cannot succeed unless you acquire a lot of data from your participants to know what are the circumstances. Now, it's since 1993 that the sort of the American Psychological Association has come up with sort of guidelines for avoiding ageist tendencies in our research. So first of all, they say that inadequate operational definition of the age variable, it needs to be avoided. So describing sample characteristics by large age groupings, such as under or over 65, they say that is invalid. And now we do know that it's invalid, and this is why we are trying to sort of predict age from the shape of the brain, for instance. Inadequate analytical approaches. A, confusing age difference with age changes, overlooking individual differences, ignoring magnitude of age changes, not reporting the absence of difference in presence of age stereotypes or characteristics, reporting age differences that are found accidentally without age having a justification in being included in the research. So they think that these are some of the inadequate analytical approaches that need to be avoided. And their recommendation is that age should not be dealt with as a causal factor in any of the analysis that research is doing. So let me give you a few examples of what we have learned in the studies that we did at Perform Center. One of the things that initially when I came to Montreal, I wanted to do because I couldn't drug people was that, okay, I do know what is, for instance, this pain drug doing to which part of the brain. So I'm going to use a game that is going to be involving the same set of networks. And I want to see whether there is an equivalent sort of response in terms of stress hormones, in terms of physiological responses by activating the brain areas with games. So we started by looking at the older adults, and we set, with support from Habib actually, we set up a study of gaming grannies. So let me tell you, initially when I called this study Gaming Grannies, and I thought, oh, this is like such a cool name, people came back to me and said, like, gaming grannies, like, don't use the word grannies. This is, this is offensive. In fact, during the recruitment, people wrote to me and said, oh, why are you just recruiting grannies? How about grandpas? So we realized that we have to change this word immediately before going into the ethics. So we called it gaming for older adults, and that became more inclusive. So this is an example of the language preventing people from even coming to your study. Now, the objective of this was actually to measure the physiological responses and memory responses to 3 types of games that were supposed to be enhancing cognition and also physical activity. So the method of recruitment was Perform's formidable, data pool, participant pool. The method of screening was that we were, of course, interested in people who have the physical and the visual ability to play these games, but then also we measured their attitude towards these games before enrolling them into the study. Of course, we would have enrolled everyone, but this was my control measure to see who is and who is not participating in our study. And then we measured the sources of individual variations with MoCA, with appraisal of gaming, individual interviews, and all sorts of physiological measurements that we did in them. And the outcome measure was physiological stress and memory. So one of the first things that we learned was that those who had a negative attitude towards playing games, they just didn't participate. We had about maybe 50 or so people who took the survey, but from those, only 30 of them continued to participate in our study. And those who continued to participate in our study, they had a generally more positive attitude towards games, or at least they were curious about it. The other thing that we found is that in those 33 who participated, those who had a positive belief about games improving their cognition, they had a different physiological response compared to those who had a negative attitude towards playing games. So these significant differences, they were measured in terms of their cortisol response, their stress response to those games, in terms of their heart rate variability, and also in terms of their electrodermal stress response. Interestingly, those who had a more positive effect, they had more heightened physiological response, meaning that they cared more. So they cared more to try harder the game and sort of be more engaged with it. We took the same experiment to the living lab. So we set up a living lab in the Cavendish Mall. And here we didn't have the super aging participants of Perform Center. I have worked with quite a few of them, what we learned is that people who are participating in my gaming study, they come out of my gaming study and they run into the sleep lab to go, do a sleep lab. So there is all of these interactions that at Perform, actually, we do have the ability of monitoring how people are participating in one study to the other and how these carryover changes might be impacting the results. But these are things for the data scientists to do. So we took the same experiment into the Engaged Living Lab. And here we were specifically focusing on, okay, so who is coming? Who is interested in the kind of study that we are doing? And what we found is, again, there is significant socio-demographic differences between the population who showed interest in our study at Perform and those who came to the Living Lab at the Cavendish Mall. So in general, the Perform volunteers, they had higher education, better socioeconomic status, they had better social networks, they were more educated, they were less depressed, and in general, they had more self-efficacy compared to those who came to the Living Lab. The motivation for social interaction in both of these studies, both at Perform and the Engaged Living Lab, we realized that the individuals who are participating in these research studies, they come there to hang out with us. At Perform, they're curious about the latest, greatest research that is happening. At the Engaged Living Lab, they came to actually please our students so that they can come back and play games or knit or do whatever they were doing. So this socialization was an important aspect of participating in research. And the other thing that we realized is that self-ageism was indeed a barrier to recruitment. So people who came to the Engaged Living Lab and then they absolutely refused to, pick up the VR and play with it, they always prefaced their refusal, but, oh no, I'm too old to do this. And this, I am too old to do this, was something that we heard quite often from them. Now we did another study, so it was, yeah.
Would you then encourage them to participate, or you just leave them?
We did not force them. So we had students, and then the students, what they learned is that people who became sort of interested and comfortable with playing these games, they were the ones who were coming there for a period of time. And then this is one of the things that after they sort of forged these relationships with our assistants, then they felt comfortable to actually participate. But then there were some who would, be casually reminded, do you want to participate in this study? And like they would say no. We had put a little sort of poster in front of the door on certain days for people to come and participate. And we realized that the uptake for this was not so great. People who did participate, so did not participate because they were ageist, self-ageist, participated because they wanted to learn how to communicate with their grandchildren. So a lot of them came to participate with their grandchildren, and then some of them actually came to hang out with our young students, and like they liked them, so they wanted to play with them for that reason. So we did a similar study. This was funded by TELUS, sort of project that was led by Shannon Hebelthwaite and a group of people from psychology, communication, and I was coordinating this study for them. And we realized that, so this study was really interdisciplinary. We had all sorts of measurements. We had psychosocial measurements, we had lifestyle measurements, and we also had actual psychophysical measurements. And in this study, the aim was to sort of recruit 78 people to have a high power, statistical power, and to see whether socializing over Zoom is going to have a measurable effect on their well-being and our depression. And this recruitment process was really interesting. We realized that, again, we started by recruiting through the Perform list. We realized that more than 70%, 37% of people open their email. So this, I was told by Sriram that this is a very high opening rate. So people were interested in the topic of the study. However, from these 1,555 who opened their email, or only 78 contacted us. Out of those 78, 33 of them expressed interest in our study. Only 18 of them explicitly expressed disinterest in our study. 12 of them told us why, and I would tell you what we learned from that. And then 16 out of 33 They continued through the study, which was a longitudinal, it was a 5-week study. They had to take photographs, attend Coursera, come and hang out with us in social. So it was a heavy protocol. But what is interesting is that 3 of them, when they were randomized into the group who didn't have any social activity, they refused to participate. And they said, we would only participate if we are in a group who has a social, who has a social component in it. So these are the biases that we decided to sort of capture, measure these, and see what we can learn from them. So as random controlled trials go, this was a failure. But by documenting every stage of participant flow, we were able to actually learn from this study quite a bit. Now, we used consort, and I'm not going to go through, principles of consort. It's a paper, it's a statement. You can look into it, but it's a checklist. It's a checklist of all the sort of steps of a clinical trial from the point of conceiving the project theoretically to going through the ethics approval, to data collection, subject recruitment, the modification. And the point is that you go through this checklist and then you collect. Yeah.
Excuse me, I just have a question about the previous slide.
Yeah.
What is a link with inclusion criteria? Because for me, it's not an inclusion criteria. The fact that few people will accept to participate, it's not an inclusion criteria.
The inclusion criteria, so it was announced in the call for recruitment. So in order to include participants, they had to have a computer. So this is, I come to this, restrictive inclusion criteria.
Yeah.
People who they had to have a computer, they had to have a digital camera, they had to be able to sort of see and hear Zoom. So the inclusion criteria in and of itself was restrictive because people who had disability, somebody else could have taken advantage of having a social gathering, right? But then the study itself was not an inclusive design because it was so tied to having access to technology and then being able to use the technology. But even regardless of that, there were people who had all of those inclusion criteria, but then they still refused to participate because of time, because of season, because they refused to do the silly MOCA test. I would sort of read for you the...
Okay. But for me, it's not really a bias in the way that if the conclusion is that the social interaction is true and under certain conditions that are, for example, social environment, some social environment or access to technology. As long as we precise the condition in which it's true, it's not a bias.
No, I understand. But what I'm trying to say is that, in my opinion, when there are 1,555 people who are interested in knowing what this research is about, and then out of those, only 16 end up participating in this. So this is biased because this by no means is a representative sample. And the fact that, we initially had 33 who actually at least took the survey of pre-enrollment. So they had to take a survey and then we would tell them, okay, if you have completed this survey, then come to this and that date and then participate in this study. But even those, they were not representative. So what I'm saying is that sometimes the design itself is not inclusive. So we would be presenting this study as a study that is showing that socialization via Zoom and learning online has a benefit to older adults. But it's not an inclusive study because which older adults are we addressing, right? It's only the rich ones who have the financial means of spending, 10 hours of their time on Zoom and socializing over digital photography. So the study itself was not inclusive. So the conclusions from this study, they cannot be generalized to healthy aging or to older adults.
As any study, it's hard to have a complete inclusive study. Every study,
exactly. So what is it? All models are wrong, but we can't do without them. So basically that's the principle. So the idea of consort is that every step of the design that you're doing, you need to document it and do whatever you can to document the minute changes in the study, and then you have to report every single one of those. And the idea is that if you have done this thing, if you have gone through this checklist, then your RCT is going to have a higher quality. Now, the other approach that might be appropriate for doing studies that pertain to lifestyle, to brain, to mind, and to behavior, this is a work that has been done by, that has been proposed by Gregory Bateson, is taking a cybernetic approach for capturing the biases. And what does a cybernetic approach sort of involve? You would do some form of an ecological monitoring of all the parameters in the data, and then you would be looking at the interactions between them. And if you're doing an experiment, you would do this experiment by giving it a play flavor. So for instance, if you are dealing with the problem of, pain, so this is something that I have done in pain. So chronic pain is something that is really miserable. Chronic pain is something that is stigmatizing people. People who have chronic pain, they are disabled, they cannot work, they are a burden to themselves and to the society. And the idea is that if you create a condition for the participants to come up with a solution or to try different things, then from these trials, from the noise that exists in the model, you would be learning some facts and some truths. And it says that, you know, all the phenomena that we are measuring, they're either observable phenomena. So for instance, the behaviors that individuals are manifesting, for instance, the inability to move, inability to see, you know, reflecting on pain, reflecting on memory, all of those things. Each of them have an underlying mechanism. Those underlying mechanisms, they are biological, for instance, they're physical. But then there are explanatory constructs that are linking between these. So in the models that we are constructing, we want to be looking at the interaction between all of these. And he is suggesting that if we introduce a little bit of modification in things that we can modify, so we inject a little bit of noise into this dichotomy in terms of play, which is what we do in experimental design. And then if we are recording it, then we would be able to sort of figure out what are the sources of tension. So, yeah.
What do you mean with the modeling?
So let me get to it, I'll show you what I mean. So when you're modeling something, you want, in any experimental condition, you're parameterizing things, right? So you, for instance, you have a model, and then in this model, you have parameter A, B, and C. And then sometimes you say, okay, so what if I change this parameter? So you do it mathematically with an abstract concept. We do it as experimentalists. We can introduce a little bit of noise into the system. So for instance, I would say, okay, you people, you run this distance, and then I would measure the speed of their running this distance, and I would measure their heart rate and this and that. So the little bit of play that I would introduce into this is I would tell them, run as much as you want until your heart rate is increasing, or until you think that your heart rate is increasing. So I loosen the end of this distance for them, but then I would be able to measure person A has run 20 meters and person B has run 23 meters. So this variation would be the flexibility that I introduce into the protocol, and then I would be able to measure that. So this is what we did actually in the TELUS study. And what did we learn from the refusal to enroll? One said, I would be interested in participating as long as I do not have to do the ladybug, elephant, zebra test, which is the MOCA test, which always left me feeling like an idiot. So people don't like MOCA. Random selection of people for discussion groups especially would be a problem. Is there a way to be involved in that part of, to not be involved in that part of it? One says that the invitation caught my interest and my anger. I know that I will not be considered a candidate for your study because I do not use Zoom. So this is when people are interested in participating in the studies, but then my inclusion criteria is sort of preventing them from doing so. Now, in terms of adding a little bit of playfulness, initially the intervention was for people to join in groups of 5 or 6, and then they would be discussing their experience with the Zoom. And very soon we learned that participants, they found the course to be very boring. So we had to add a little bit of modification for the next group and give them the opportunity to sort of modify the course or to watch as much as the course as they thought was interesting to them. They were also interested in sharing their data. So in the third group, we sort of allowed them to follow the course as they wanted, but then also introduce their own, their own assignments and share their assignments. So what I'm trying to say is that in that failed random control trial, what we learned is from the preferences of the individuals as we kept adding different elements to the study to see, okay, which one of them is likely to keep people more in the study. And this is a little tool that we have created. As I said, this is for studying pain. So in this paper, we are articulating, it's a group project. It's a position paper written by psychiatrists, anesthesiologists, pain scientists, pain patients. And then we are acknowledging that in the relationship between an individual and the healthcare system, there are quite a lot of other institutes and cultural constructs that are defining our relationship to our own health. And we need to have a framework to capture as much data as possible if we are to sort of come up with precise models of what intervention, what medicine would be working for whom and for what. So this digital platform, it's allowing to collect qualitative data. And it's allowing people to sort of, when they're going into, say, a random control trial about trying something specific, say an exercise for their back pain, but at the same time, it gives them a portal to provide other data about themselves, about their day, about their preferences into, into what has happened in their day. So we have piloted this one in a study with Maryse Fortin, who has given this app to participants who are trying aquatherapy for their chronic back pain. And we are waiting to hear from the results of the our new grant application. So if it's granted, please come and collaborate and use it in your research, because I think it's going to be promising. So in conclusion, what we have learned from these studies from the past 7-8 years of hanging out with older adults and doing all sorts of qualitative and quantitative studies with them, and this is also work that I did for my PhD. I didn't get into it. Why I'm interested in how older adults are perceiving specific tasks differently than younger ones. I think it's very important to consider. But what we have learned is that volunteers are either biased or towards or against the topic of research. And that is sort of leading to having non-representative samples. In general, people are participating in a research if they think there is value to it, but that means that we are leaving behind a large population who might need our interventions, but they're not coming into it. Those who are volunteering, they usually have higher resources and self-efficacy than those who avoid and refuse to participate. This is something that in Canada is important. We do have a legacy of scientific racism, specifically against the Indigenous people. And this is why they are creating their own mechanisms for data collection and for doing research. So refusal to participate is important. Self-ageism, it does impact volunteering, but it also impacts the physiological and biological responses of individuals to certain experimental conditions. And it's impossible to avoid bias. We all have biases inside ourselves, but it's important to capture the sources of bias. And what I would recommend, and this is something that I would do in studies, if I'm designing a study that is involving older populations, I would try to not mention age as a criteria. I know that this is something that the ethics review boards demand, but I think we need to be arguing against it. We need to be recruiting from a certain pool of people, but then decide later on their age or on their physical and mental conditions, whether we want to include them. And then maybe age should be not an explanatory variable, but an auxiliary or maybe even a dependent variable to see, whether certain model is predicting variations in age or not. So creating a space for receiving feedback from study participants is important. Giving the participants freedom to deviate from protocol while documenting it is important, and also capturing qualitative data. And qualitative data can be observed, can be gathered from conversations with participants and also from observations that the data collection team is doing. And luckily, we now have these large language processing models that are going to allow us to actually extract data, quantitative data from some of these narratives.
Just the fact to allow participants to deviate from the protocol itself can lead to other bias.
Yeah, it does, but then we are measuring it. So bias is unavoidable. It's just a matter of taking a new approach to bias instead of masking it, actually highlighting it. So, for instance, in the study that we did, we wanted 87 participants. We ended up with only 16. So what happened? What created that bias? I think the knowledge that we gained through that exercise was valuable. But then again, I think which one of us doesn't hate being old? We are all working to defy aging, and we want to be healthy aging. Self-ageism, it does pose barriers to inclusive and informative research, but it's also detrimental to health, as Levy has shown in a range of research that she's doing. And in the age of data science, adding flexibility to research is actually a possibility. I think the reason why we have been fixing our research protocols in the past is because we did not have the capacity to model data. But right now, we basically can have a model, but we can also sort of explore a wide range of data and seek patterns that we probably would not have found. Without the capacity of the computers that we have today. And I think that is the key to doing person-centered research, to allow individuals sort of express themselves as much as possible to sort of know what intervention would be suitable to whom. And I managed to sort of miss creating the acknowledgement slide because I ran out of time. I have to thank Dr. Banali, Dr. Kim Sochak, the Perform Center, my colleagues in the Netherlands, Dr. Lawrence Kermeyer, for doing the work that I presented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naj, for this very interesting presentation. So the floor is open for questions.
So you say that, yeah, we can capture the bias when we ask for comment or when we allow deviation of protocol, but then how do you propose to handle this bias in the model?
I don't know. I would ask Habib. He would have a solution for it. No, this is a great question. I think to have this data, it always, in my experience, it always helps post hoc analysis. And let me give you a very practical example. My colleagues in the Netherlands, they had done a drug study with spinal anesthesia. So they had a very solid model of, sort of cutting this peripheral pain network is going to be increasing the pain perception in those who had received the spinal anesthesia. What we found is that the order of randomization did have an impact on perception of pain and on physiological responses. The fact that they had not collected any qualitative data just to see whether this randomization, whether individuals who came into the study had an anticipation about what spinal anesthesia would do to them. The fact that we did not have any information about individual perceptions in the course of that very tightly designed clinical trial, it limited our interpretation. So we had to do some arm waving exercise. Oh, probably this is because they were more anxious, probably because, they were more relaxed if they had received the spinal anesthesia in the first session versus the other one. So if we had that information, then our interpretations would have been a little bit more precise. And then we would have had knowledge based on which we could have designed. Now we have knowledge that we need to design the next experiment by accounting for these variations in perception. And I think this is particular to the studies of, placebo is a very important factor in brain studies. So this placebo factor, it needs to be accounted for either in experimental design, or we need to have some data to help our interpretations. Now, how would we add it into the model? I don't know yet, but I think that is one of the things that we are trying to learn, how to incorporate data that is coming from the social, personal, psychological, cultural, all of these data. We are realizing that they're very important, especially in mental health research, in anything that pertains to brain. But how do we incorporate it into our models? I think that's for us to figure out.
So, like you say, there are cultural differences towards aging, like West or Oriental
Yeah.
culture. But that's also true in many African countries, I think, all Africa, where aging is generally associated to wisdom.
Yeah.
So, which leads to some people sometimes to behave like, I mean, older
Than they are.
actually,
Yeah,
they
yeah,
are,
yeah.
actually. So I wonder what would possibly be the impact of that mindset on their actual health, for example. Are there any studies in that topic?
There is quite a bit of research sort of looking, and research actually does show. So for instance, I have looked into it closely in pain research. So yes, there are significant associations between quantifiable, for instance, perceptions of pain, quantitative pain measurements across different races. So for instance, the Asians, in a study that was done a few years ago, the Asians, they seem to sort of be more stoic, and then they report lower pain, lower whatever pain scales, while others would be reporting more, and then they would be reporting more because they think they are not taken seriously in the healthcare system, and then because of that they're sort of increasing, and then this is creating some form of a stigma and implicit bias, in a sense that the medical community is not paying attention to the racialized pain as much because they think they're just faking their pain, or they think that there are drug seekers and things like that. In terms of aging, again, Levy, the studies that Levy has shown, they are showing that there is cultural differences in terms of how different cultures are, for instance, performing, the bias in the performance that is coming from self-ageism, that seems to be less in the Asian population than it is in the, but these are actually some of the newer things that people are starting to pay attention to. So this is, yeah.
It would be interesting to
Look into. Yeah.
So I have several
Question and comment, but let me start with the general comment about bias, because and the question comes in different domain. Is it good or is it bad?
Yeah.
Because when we talk about bias, we almost time have in mind, oh, it's not good.
Yeah.
It's not good. It depends. In reality, it depends. It depends if we are aware about the bias or we are not aware.
Yeah.
So let me explain this. If I am aware about one bias in my protocol, so it seems that my protocol is dedicated to a specific
Yeah.
population.
Yeah.
Okay, so all the inference that I am going to do, I am aware that this is not for general population, but this is specific to my population.
Yeah.
So in this case, bias is good. I mean, it's, I can give some general conclusion about a
That
specific
specific population.
population.
Yeah.
And this is exactly the idea of doing inference in statistics. So because I was moving between two school. One is English school who are doing inference about specific hypothesis. We call this in statistics, I fix a hypothesis and I validate this hypothesis or not. Okay, this is one way to look at the data set. And there is another view who comes from the school of Ben-Zekri and others who says, okay, I'm not aware about all the bias. So why I have to specify one specific hypothesis? Let me generalize to all the population. And the idea is, okay, what do I get from the data? So I'm collecting data from everywhere, everybody, etc. So, and I look at the data afterwards. I'm not interested by doing inference in specific hypotheses. Okay, and so the idea is, okay, what is the best approach? And these two schools of statistics comes like opposite, but now people knows that, okay, they are not opposite at all, because we ignore a lot of bias. So the best approach to any kind of protocol is just to open the protocol. Okay? And this is what you think about not fixing the age, not fixing this, not doing this. And in this case, what you are doing is just opening the protocol as large as possible, and then come back and look at the data. Okay, and the data speak for themselves. So we can do some categories, and if we identify a category of population, so now we can objectively specify something like, oh, I identified women of age more than 65 in my study. So is this something that can be generalized for all the women for more than 65? This is another question. I identify first, and then I can have like a bias protocol who specify only for this population to impose a hypothesis on this, and then study if the hypothesis is true or not, who can be generalized to all the population. So we can use both of them. But what is interesting is that we identify all the bias. It means that you are showing us, or maybe we don't have all bias, but we have them. Yeah, I think that we have a lot, and we can identify in this case the different protocol and how we can deal with the bias, because this is one of the questions. We identify bias, how we can deal with the bias. So yeah, we can specify a hypothesis with this bias and then move doing this inference. Otherwise, because there is a lot and we don't know which one is the more important, I agree with your idea to open the protocol and make it more general than what it is. Okay, this is just a general comment and my feeling how we can take into account the different bias and what we can learn from the bias themselves. We can include in the population. But I have no question about this because you talk about aging and culture, and of course the aging is not when I moved to North Africa, and there is like a tradition, it's in Africa in general, how we can aging is a very important aspect. So when you age, whatever your physical conditions, you get more power.
Yeah.
That's how the society is organized. So the point of view of the aging is not something that I live in, let's say in France, but in Europe in general. This is exactly the same kind of model over here in North America. So aging is not something who has the same meaning depending on different cultures. So how we can integrate this within the protocol, and especially in Canada, because Canada is, I'm looking at this society as a collection of of people coming from, they're coming with their background, with their culture. It's not a culture that mixed between different populations. All of them comes now, let's say now, even if they come 20 years or 50 years before, but they are still living exactly, it's like a copy passed from the picture to here. Yeah, what the changes that I see is more material. So they become a little bit more rich or more comfortable, which is completely fine. This is why they come. It's more economic.
Yeah.
And say economy, all those comes because liberty is not in their countries. And this is very important aspect of our life. So, yeah.
They are producing new culture, even if they have some.
They are producing the culture. This is what I see in the few that I know their culture well. I mean, people from North Africa who are here now. They have their own. Even for eating, they are eating exactly the same as North Africa. They have their shop, specific shop. They do some meetings between families, etc. Exactly like this is why I'm saying copy paste, and they are doing this here because they feel themselves like comfortable within this kind of environment. So, and we age here in this kind of situation. So what it seems to me that aging in this case is like another aging than the aging that we are talking about.
I mean, I think with aging, but I think what I'm trying to say is that we need to remove the word aging from the discussions of health, right? For instance, I might have arthritis at the age of 25, and somebody who is 85 might have arthritis. So the problem that we are trying to solve is the problem that is coming from the wear and tear of joints. Now, somebody who is 85, they're suffering pain. Somebody who's 25, they're suffering pain. And I think if you focus on the pain from arthritis, then we would be including a population who is 85 and a population who's 25. But of course, we would be measuring different biomarkers in somebody who's 25 versus 85. We would be measuring different set of medications, medical history, and we would accept that somebody who is 85, it's wear and tear. Would we decide to do a knee replacement surgery on something who's 95 or on somebody who's 25? So I think in that sense, we need to focus on health, because some people get to their age of 90 and they are completely healthy, nothing happens to them. Some people are, need a lot of support when they are 35. So I think just focusing on healthy aging, in my opinion, I think about this from an intercultural perspective. I see it is stressing us as a society in general. And I think this stress, this societal global stress, is reflected in the fact that WHO and like most of our funding agencies and all of our research efforts are focusing on this healthy aging. So this is what I call a double bind. We face mortality one way or the other. Just this quest for never ever dying. I think it comes from Alexander the Great. We have it in our legends that Alexander the Great started conquering India in search of elixir to sort of live forever. But I think like these different cultures also have a different attitude towards mortality. And I think when we talk about healthy aging and then we are tying it to mortality, to longevity, when we are valorizing people who are 10 and who are still running marathons, it's a cultural construct that we are creating, which is divorced from the issue of health, in my opinion. So I think in our research, if you're focusing on health, if you're focusing on Alzheimer's as a health condition, as opposed to as an aging condition, then we might even be opening our research to, including more. People can have Alzheimer's in younger age, right? So why do we need to only be screening people who are 65 and over? And where does this number 65 come from? It's coming from our economy, because we retire at the age of 65, right? And like we have people who never retire, such as our great brain scientist, Brenda Miller. So I think there is an economic argument in all of this healthy aging, and we are better off not to tie it to any age number. And I think to just take the word age out of the whole equation, yes, it's a variable. We're measuring weight as well, right? But we are not saying we are recruiting people who are 55 kilos and more. So just to remove this numerical value of age from research might be helpful also in our models.
But weight, if we don't impose criteria on weight, because weight have much less impact on what we are measuring most of the time, the effect of anything than age. Age have an impact on many things in brain imaging and in many signals that we can measure. Often it's influence and it's impacted by age. So we need to put it most of the time as a covariate, and when it limits too much the real functioning of the study, for me it's quite logical to put a limit of age, because balance, benefits, and inconvenience would be negative to include them.
But the question is, all the studies that I know are, what is the, usually are focused on deficit and cost, and this comes related to age, directly and indirectly. When we talk about neurodegeneration, we know that neurodegeneration comes in majority later, and this is also automatically we make a link between age and neurodegeneration.
Yeah.
But neurodegeneration is seen like a problem with a high cost for the society. So aging comes like, oh, aging is going to cost more for the society. And this is a big bias of the way that we are going to conduct the analysis, or think about the problem of the analysis. Or maybe we can have like other people talk about biological aging, which make like more homogeneous things. Biological aging is not the conventional aging. There is a correlation between the two, but it's not exactly the same. As you mentioned, people can have Alzheimer's in the 14.
Yeah.
And so in this case, biological aging is something who make you like uniform all the population. Maybe it's a more related. I understand that there is an effect related to the biological aging for anything we are doing. So I prefer using this rather than 65, because 65 is related to the fact that people are dying.
Yeah, but
So-
this is based on physiological aspects.
No, it's not.
Not randomly.
Not completely.
Well,
Not
it's,
completely.
It's also a choice. Like,
yeah, but we have to
Some-
put a threshold.
No. Why? If at 65, now you want to buy a house and you are more than 65, go to the bank and I can let you know that from the economic point of view, the price is not exactly the same because you are simply more than 65.
But it's normal from their point of view, because statistically you have more risk to develop.
And that's what I'm proposing to the bank, put the biological age, and what the risk comes from the fact that you are not able to pay because you are ill, because you are, okay, So.
Yeah, it will be
But-
another threshold, but you also can include everything in the model, your lifestyle habit and everything to make it more accurate to
Exactly.
the reality, but it wouldn't be less discriminatory, because why someone who has chronic disease will need to pay? Well, it's another debate, but
Yeah.
when you say that age is a bias because it's a cost, well, the fact that we say that age cost to the society, it's a bias. I don't agree with that. It's not bias. It's a fact that on average, age people cost more because they are more ill. That doesn't mean that every old people will cost to the society, but we can't deny the group effect. The fact that on average, yeah, a smoker will cost more to society. Age people, old people will cost more to society. It's not a bias.
No, I agree with you. So just to treat this as a fact, and this is something that people who are proponents of healthy aging, they're arguing that just to assume that age is a fact is in and of itself an ageist, it creates ageist stereotypes. And this is what, the director of aging at the NIH has been arguing since 1969. And this is why the guidelines in APA are sort of trying to, so let's break free from this statistical notion that age is associated with more deficit, because they say that this is creating the implicit biases and the internalized, prejudices. And we are saying in terms of data to sort of assume that age is a fact that is associated with more cost and deficit. It would prevent somebody like Habib, who is a very healthy aging 50-year-old gentleman from participating in studies, in studies of healthy aging, because they just don't identify with that image of being a deficient, costly older adults. The other thing that, to me, it's curious, it's not part of this, but I'm realizing that more and more this fear of aging is making people of my generation, especially my generation, who's dealing with older adults, who are refusing to accept their older adults because they are not from that traditional mindset of, okay, being old, you're old, you have respect, you're going to eventually die. They want to live eternally. And I'll give you an example. So for instance, one of my uncles just drove into my sister and almost killed my sister because at the age of 90, he refuses to give up his car, right? So when we are dealing with that, I say, I don't want to age. And what am I going to do? I'm going to go to the Netherlands and I'm going to ask for a euthanasia because I'm becoming demented. So we are creating, with this focus on age and healthy aging, we are creating a new culture. And with this culture, we're going to have to be living. It's going to have ethical, it's going to have medical, it's going to have resource implications. And because we are aware of the biopolitics of this aging, I think a lot of us, the fear of participating in studies is the fear of stigma. I don't want to participate in this study that is going to administer a MOCA to me because, what if the MOCA is showing that my score is below 25? What if they see that the size of my hippocampus is too small? What if my ventricles are too large, right? I'm not going to go into the scanner from the fear of knowing it even myself. Because even if I know this myself, then what is the solution? Is somebody going to inject something into my hippocampus and increase its size? So we are creating knowledge, we are creating statistical, reproducible statistical facts. And with that, we are creating new forms of stigma. And that's what's in my, with science comes the potential of it's a statistical fact, right? And therein lies the social
It depends how we see aging. So I just would like to take two examples. Age is fact.
Yeah,
No question on that. But let's take age and look at healthy or non-healthy aging. Non-healthy aging, if you look at some statistics that I know from France, here it's probably the same. It costs. So we can And this is a fact. You do the correlation between the cost and age for health, and you see that the cost is more higher. So if you focus on that, so aging becomes like a kind of negative aspect. And implicitly you integrate that, oh, aging costs a lot to the society and so on. But at the same time, we see that during the period of COVID, there are some statistics who comes showing that the grandparent mostly support the younger and support them. I mean, they give them money to lead, and the part, they have the economic part of view because they are retired, they have more finance, and they support the society heavily. I mean, few million of euro are invested by those persons from their own money to support the society and to make the society more equilibrium. So aging in this case is seen like a very positive thing because they have more support and they are supporting the society. So this is the inverse regarding the two. So what I want to say is that the stigma of aging cost is like a specific view, and we need to integrate other aspects from the aging because it's not the same. Aging is a fact. I agree, but there is positive, there is negative. But this is true for any kind of age. If I want to say, if you are young, you don't have you cost less for the health point of view, but you cost maybe a lot for you need to live, and the society is supporting you. So from this point of view, it's negative. So that's from my point of view, that make an equilibrium between different ages, and we need to have this kind of view for aging. That's all what I mean.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we can present the aging cost to healthcare system, but it can bring money through the tax fees and everything. But yeah, that's completely true. But when we look, for example, at the interest of an insurance company, health insurance company, that's normal for their interest to that's normal. I mean, that makes sense to adapt the fees to the age because there is more risk when we age. But
I'm actually, I would like to disagree a bit on this because I heard yesterday that all there is two territories in France, the south of France, where the insurance companies stop supporting the people with their own. I mean, the insurance is not renewed. Why? What is the reason? They make some statistics, and there is a lot of inondation. Yeah, flood. And because it comes every time this year, at least 4 times in this region, it costs a lot for those people. And what they do is that they say, oh, here is the risk, and now we just suppress here, suppress here, suppress here. And I agree with the government because I heard yesterday it's a proposal of law saying that if the insurance goes only in the green side where they make more money, they are going to participate more than those who choose to make equilibrium between green and non-green to support the people. And for me, it makes sense. So it makes sense that in fact, insurance has only their pocket in their brain, and they have only money. So they make age like a problem. I would like to equilibrate between everything, and age becomes like something, maybe, of course, age is going to cost a little bit for health point of view, a little bit more, but we need to have like kind of equilibrium everywhere otherwise, it seems to me that we are going to treat the people, when people age, we are going to consider them, I mean, like a specific population from the consumer's point of view, which is something that I think it's not fair at all.
Okay, but it's another aspect that I totally agree with, but it's moral aspect. So it doesn't oppose to what I say, that it was in the interest of the insurance company to make fees according to, or to make
lot of society. That's not moral.